The Seventh Tower by Garth Nix. Book 6, The Violet Keystone. Chapter 4. The Icecarls had barely finished rolling the last of the barrels into their makeshift fort when the sunstones in the ceiling high above flickered and then grew much brighter. Milla was the first to realize that the stones were being manipulated from a distance. The only possible reason to brighten them would be to make spirit shadows stronger. Obviously the Chosen were about to attack. "Into the fort!" Milla shouted, waving in the few Icecarls who were still carrying sacks over from the walls. Within a minute, Milla's small force was at the ready, crammed into their tight circle of barrels and sacks. Milla looked at them, so out of place in this great stone room in their furs and bone face masks, made for life out upon the ice. She had led them badly, and not just them, but all Icecarls. The fate of their world had been put into her hands, and she had failed. "They come," hissed Salson. Milla looked over the barrier. Spirit shadows were slithering in through every still-closed door, sliding along the floor before standing up along the walls. Spirit shadows of all kinds, from the thin-waisted humanoids of the guards to strange insect-like things with multiple body parts and too many legs. More and more spirit shadows kept pouring in and lining up along the walls. At least 100 spirit shadows, and more flowing through every second to join the massed ranks on all four sides of the Icecarls' fort. There was no sign of any Chosen trying to open the doors and follow them. Milla wondered if they were free shadows, the forerunners of an invasion force from Einir. "They are bound shadows, not free ones," said Audris. The spirit shadow could often tell what Milla was thinking. "I expect some of them won't make it far from the doors unless their masters follow. They'll snap back." "I don't think it will make that much difference," muttered Milla. "The Chosen mean to overwhelm us with shadows," Salson observed. "Cowards!" No, not cowards, thought Milla. It was only common sense for the Chosen to save themselves as much as possible from injury and death. Besides, they had to know that apart from Milla's talon and Jarrek's golden chain, the Icecarls had few weapons to use against the spirit shadows. Just one Merwin horn sword and some glowing algae-coated spears. They had long since used all their shadow sacks and shadow bottles. As the spirit shadows flickered and moved into position, Milla ran through everything she could do, all the weapons or tactics they could employ. "A shield maiden thinks of all things possible and expected, then does the impossible and unexpected." She didn't realize she'd spoken aloud until Salson looked at her approvingly. At the same time, Milla realized there was one weapon she hadn't thought of using, one that was particularly effective against spirit shadows when used properly. Her sunstone. The only problem was that she didn't really know how to use it. Tal had given her a few lessons, and she'd practiced a little in the heatways on the way out, but that was all. Milla stared down at the stone, watching the sparks of light inside it. What should she try and do? A red ray of destruction? She'd seen enough of them. But hadn't Tal told her that violet was the most powerful light of the spectrum? At this point, with the spirit shadows outnumbering them 20-1, surely it would be better to try a violet ray of destruction. Or better still, a violent wave of destruction. "Milla, what are you doing?" asked Audris nervously as Milla raised her hand and bent her head to focus on the sunstone. Milla ignored her. The flow of spirit shadows through the doors was lessening, and their ranks were almost complete. They would attack very soon, unless she did something. Focus, concentration, and visualization. That was what Tal had said. Milla bent her mind upon the sunstone, shutting out everything else. It was rather like the second stage of Rovkir breathing, Milla thought, and was surprised to find that she'd actually started the breathing pattern. Violet. Milla willed the sunstone to produce violet. She needed to make a great pool of violet inside the stone, and then unleash it like an avalanche upon the spirit shadows. Even if it only took out the ranks in front of her, that would give them a chance. Milla remembered a real avalanche she had seen once. It was at a gathering between the Far Raiders and their sister clan, the Frost Fighters. Both clans had left their ships under skeleton crews to celebrate and feast upon the lesser peak of Two Knuckle Mountain. It had been a great but risky celebration, as the mountain was known to be dangerous. It was sheer bravado that had led the clans to choose it. Even so, the crones had insisted on some precaution being taken, and hundreds of moth lanterns were laid in expanding rings around the central fires. Halfway through the feast, the higher peak of Two Knuckles shrugged, sending down a vast wave of snow and ice. They had heard it first, a deep roar in the darkness, louder than any beast. The outer ring of lanterns was snuffed out in an instant, and for a few blinks the inner ring lit up the avalanche as it fell upon the camp. Milla remembered it well, a wall of icy death that swept away everyone who wasn't quick enough to find shelter behind the clusters of rock. It was an avalanche she imagined now, one of solid violet. She called it up out of the stone, using all the powers of concentration and all the discipline that made her such a dangerous fighter. Violet flared. Icecarls gasped. Audra stepped even farther away and said something that Milla was too focused to hear. She could feel the avalanche coming, could feel the violet power rising in the stone. Her hand was shaking, her whole body trembling, as if a real avalanche was roaring down upon her. Instinct told her when to thrust her hand forward and let the power go. At exactly the same moment, the spirit shadows charged. Milla shouted a war cry as violet light leapt from her sunstone and spread into a wave. It was as wide as the fort and tall as an icecarl, rushing forward with a deafening crash and rumble. The wave swept every spirit shadow before it, sending them crashing and tumbling back through the walls and doors. The Icecarls cheered, but only briefly. One attack had been forestalled. There were still 3 forces coming from the remaining sides. "Sell your lives dearly!" Milla shouted as she dashed toward the side the spirit shadows would reach first. She was surprised to find Audra speeding ahead of her, and on the side she wore the talon. Nothing had ever made Audris come that close before. "It's coming back!" Audris warned. "Look out!" Milla looked behind her. The violet wave had rebounded from the wall and was ricocheting toward them. It looked stronger and more menacing from this side, and showed no signs of weakening. It had veered a little to one side in the rebound. Only half of it would strike the Icecarls' fort. "To this side!" Selsin cried, her voice at full roar in an effort to be heard above the rumble of the wave. "To this side!" Everyone was running to the safer side when the violet wave hit. Milla watched aghast as it picked up huge barrels and hurled them toward the ceiling. Sacks were blown apart. One of the shield maidens, already wounded and slow, was lifted up, thrown down onto the floor, and then rocketed out the back of the wave. If 2 of her companions hadn't caught her, she would have broken her neck. Still, the wave of light kept going. Spirit shadows, attacking only a moment before, fled in all directions as the Icecarls hunkered down as best they could, shielding themselves from the spray of debris. "Well done!" shouted Selsin to Milla. "The enemy flees. Let it run one more time through, then stop it." "Stop it?" Milla yelled back. "I don't even know how I started it.